Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's policy briefing, the evolution of U.S. China relations under President Biden, featuring Mr. Demetri Sevastopulo, U.S. China Correspondent for the Financial Times. My name is Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Sasakawa USA is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization dedicated to deepening the understanding of and strengthening the relationship between the U.S. and Japan for the benefit of a free and open international community. Our activities mainly focus on security and diplomacy through the engagement of exchanges, dialogue, analysis, publications, and networking. Today's event is being recorded and is on the record. A recap and video recording will be made available on Sasakawa USA's website in the coming weeks. There will be time for Q&A later in the program. You can submit your questions using the Q&A chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free to submit those at any time throughout the discussion today. And I would now like to turn the program over to Dr. Satohiro Akimoto, Chairman and President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA.
Thank you, Santi. I am Satohiro Akimoto, President and Chairman of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Welcome you all. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. I am delighted to have Mr. Demetri Sevastopulo today to talk about the evolution of U.S.-China relations under President Biden. Historic rise of China is probably the biggest geopolitical and geoeconomic development for the entire world, at least for the first half of this century. There are, of course, some good things in China's historic rise. More than 850 million people in China have been lifted out of miserable and extreme poverty. According to the World Bank, China's poverty rate fell from 88% in 1981 to less than 1% in 2015. However, as China becomes richer, stronger, and more confident about its future course, China begins to become more assertive about realizing its national interest and more aggressive about projecting its military and economic might. It is no exaggeration to say how to effectively deal with China, particularly from the viewpoint of keeping and strengthening liberal world order as defined by such values as democracy, freedom, rule of law, and free enterprise has become foreign policy number one for most of the countries in the world. President Biden identified the situation and made China the most important policy issues on the day one of his administration. He worked to restore relationship with the traditional allies, to strengthen coordination among Quad, to launch AUKUS, while clearly stating U.S. position to deter China's adventurism, to change status quo by resorting to various types of power and coercion. While Russia's invasion of Ukraine has forced President Biden to spend more resources on the European front than expected, he made it clear that the Asian front is his foreign policy priority by holding USA-ASEAN special summit and visiting Japan and ROK last month. But it seems to me the question is, has the Biden administration been focusing enough, effective enough, and fast enough to achieve its policy goal vis-a-vis China? I am grateful that Mr. Demetri Sevastopulo agreed to help us make sense of this critically important geopolitical matter, as he is one of the best experts to do so. Mr. Sevastopulo, currently focusing on this very subject matter as U.S. China Correspondent at the Financial Times, a position especially created for him. He also has a wide range of correspondent and bureau chief experiences in covering U.S. politics, Pentagon, CIA, China, Japan, Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, and Africa. So I'm looking forward to his remarks. Mr. Sevastopulo, floor is yours.
Satohiro, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you especially for taking the risk of having an Irishman with a Greek name speaking about China from Washington to an audience of largely Americans and Japanese. Hopefully that shows that there's some hope for globalization yet. So thank you, and good morning or good evening, everyone, if you're in Japan. I just returned from the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where you won't be surprised to learn that Taiwan was the main topic of conversation. And while I was there, I recall my last trip to Singapore in 2018, when I was covering the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit. Back then, my foreign policy focus, I was the bureau chief at the FT in Washington at the time, was squarely on North Korea. And it came as Trump and Kim had spent months exchanging fiery rhetoric, with Trump threatening fire and fury on North Korea and Kim calling Trump a dotard, which sent everyone to the dictionary to work out what the word actually meant. But it was striking in Singapore this time just how little discussion there was on North Korea, even though Kim has tested lots of rockets, including ICBMs, and is reportedly preparing for another nuclear test. And I think the explanation is simple and won't surprise any of you. There is a real and rising concern about the possibility of a U.S.-China war over Taiwan. Now, in my view, there's a growing number of people, both inside and outside the U.S. government and across the Indo-Pacific, who were previously quite dismissive about the risk that China would take military action against against Taiwan, Freudian slip, in the medium term, but are now more willing to entertain that possibility. And in my own reporting, I've detected a shift even over the past year since Admiral Davidson warned about the risks in the window leading up to 2027. So given the threatening landscape, I'd like to focus on Taiwan in my remarks. But before I do that, let me give you my 2 cents on the state of US-China relations and how I think they've evolved over the first 17 months of the Biden administration. So I'll start off by saying that I think one of the few areas, if not the only area, where Beijing and Washington agree on anything is that the Sino-US relationship is in its worst state since the countries normalized relations in 1979. And I think US and Chinese officials both readily concede that. And certainly that sentiment came out loud and clear when I was talking to people at the Shangri-La Dialogue last or 2 weekends ago. If you look back, I think US-China relations plummeted during the Trump administration, although I would say a lot of Democrats privately said to me at the time and after Trump left office that even though they didn't agree with the way he handled China in terms of maybe the rhetoric and some of the kind of the volatile approach, actually they credited him with shining a harsher spotlight on the issue, and that allowed the Democratic administration, Joe Biden, to come in and take a tougher line on China. And Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has made that very clear. But I think China itself was surprised when Biden came in and kept the same general direction on China policy, which from its standpoint has triggered a further deterioration of the relationship. But on the other hand, China has ramped up coercive and assertive behavior, both economic and military, that has forced tough responses from the US and its allies, while at the same time showing absolutely no awareness of how its own behavior has made it almost impossible to improve relations. I think over the past year or the first year and a half of the Biden administration, relations have continued to spiral downwards for the most part with no bottom in sight. But I would say that we've seen kind of 3 phases of engagement, or in some cases lack of engagement, which kind of define the first period of US-China relations under Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. I think the first phase was roughly from January 2021 to May of last year. During that period, Biden officials stressed that they didn't want to hold talks with Chinese officials just for the sake of holding talks. They wanted to only do things that they thought were substantive. And if you remember back, the one meeting that did occur during that period, the infamous event in Alaska at the Captain Cook Hotel, or as I stupidly in my copy wrote, the Captain Hook Hotel, to my chagrin, it devolved into a public spat. And the irony of the first phase was that when Biden hosted Xi Jinping, when they were both vice presidents back in 2012, Biden had stressed the importance of holding talks with China and having a strong communication relationship, because as he then argued, China and the US, the relationship between those 2 countries was going to shape the 21st century. And certainly that hasn't changed. If anything, that has just gotten stronger and stronger. But I think Alaska illustrated how the approach about having talks had kind of gone out the window at the start of the Biden administration. And I remember at the end of the meeting, in one of the private sessions, Yang Jiechi, the top Chinese foreign policy advisor, said he looked forward to welcoming the US team in Beijing for another round, to which Blinken replied, "Thank you." And then that prompted Yang to say, well, what does thank you mean? Does that mean that Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan would actually come to Beijing? And Blinken looked at Yang and he replied, "Thank you means thank you." Now, I think in a sense, the second phase started around May 2021 when China decided it was actually going to give the US some of its own medicine and turn the tables around. So on the military front, when Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin asked for a meeting with his appropriate counterpart, which is General Xu Qilang, the vice chair of the Central Military Commission, Beijing refused, and it was only willing to offer him a meeting with Wei Fenghe, the Chinese defense minister, who all of you know is, ranks lower in the Chinese system than Lloyd Austin does in the American system. But back to May 2021, heading into that summer, Wendy Sherman, the Deputy Secretary of State, signaled to Beijing that she wanted to visit China. But the trip almost fell through when China initially didn't grant her a meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, which the US viewed as a snub. Now, the meeting eventually went ahead after some back and forth in Tianjin in July. But as Wendy Sherman was meeting some of her counterparts, China was tweeting criticism of the US actually as the meeting was occurring, giving Sherman a kind of dose of Trump-like medicine and underscoring how relations were just going from bad to worse, and there was no sign of improvement on the horizon. I remember after that meeting, US officials complained that their encounters with Chinese officials, both in Alaska and in Tianjin, were essentially pointless because there was no real actual discussion. And then, Kurt Campbell committed the Washington sin of saying the truth out loud a couple of months later when he quipped that there was no point in talking to Wang or Yang because neither was within 100 miles of Xi Jinping's inner circle. And whether that's actually the case or not in the case of Yang, it illustrated the frustration, I think, in the White House and beyond at the lack of responsiveness from China and some of the core issues. So I think after the summer last year, the White House decided that it needed to change course and that it was important for Biden and Xi to actually have more interaction to help overcome the big stumbling blocks in the relationship. And Biden decided it was necessary to try and set guardrails to ensure that the US and China don't end up in a conflict, for example, over Taiwan. That realization paved the way for a phone call between the leaders in September of last year, which then ushered in what I would say is the third phase and led to a virtual summit in November. And the two leaders held another call in March, and they're expected to hold another call or virtual meeting at some point in the coming weeks, most likely after the G7 summit this weekend. But I think it's fair to say that those calls and virtual meetings have done very little to improve the relationship, or from the US perspective, done virtually nothing to change Chinese behavior. And I've been struck at how US officials have kind of tweaked their language about what they say is the goal of Biden's China policy. At the start of the administration, some officials would say that they had little hope, that they had some hope, I should say, that the US and its allies could convince Xi Jinping to change course, even if only in small ways. But now I think the mantra has changed, and the line is that the US is not trying to change Chinese behavior, but is trying to shape the international environment. And I think that reflects how difficult the US-China relationship has become, and kind of an increasingly pessimistic view about what the US can do. On the other hand, it's not clear to me what shaping the international environment actually means if you're not ultimately trying to shape the environment to put pressure on China to change course and uphold the international rules-based order. But to be fair to the administration, I think they have been quite successful in shaping the international landscape, both with allies and partners across Asia and Europe. I think one of the most notable changes has been the increased convergence with Europe over China. The US and EU have both put out Indo-Pacific strategies that are broadly aligned, In one example that I think was quite surprising and maybe not known at the time, when the US, EU, Canada, and UK imposed sanctions on Chinese officials over Xinjiang last year, just a few days after the Alaska summit, it was actually the Europeans who had come to the Americans and said, let's do this together, as opposed to the reverse. And that was quite important because it signaled that the EU was willing to do this, meant that Germany, which has historically been, as many people know, more reluctant to jeopardize its trade relations with China, was actually backing the joint action. And I think that signaled a shift in Europe. In another example, I think, of a successful diplomacy, Biden convened a virtual summit of the Quad in spring of 2021. I think here again, Trump gets credit for resurrecting this security grouping after 15 years or so, but Biden built on that. The four leaders have since met twice in person in Washington and in Tokyo last month. And while the Quad has limitations, it shows, I think, how even India is willing to play a bigger role to counter China in the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is a very, very important trend to watch. In more surprising places, the US has also worked with countries such as the UK, for example, to boost its naval presence in Asia and to show China that Western countries and their Asian allies and partners are increasingly united against assertive military behavior from China, either around Taiwan or the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. And perhaps the most dramatic example of the new approach on China was AUKUS, which, while it ruffled feathers in Paris, it clearly sent a powerful signal to Beijing. In other areas, Biden has followed suit after Trump by imposing sanctions on Chinese officials over Xinjiang and Hong Kong. He's placed more Chinese companies on technology export blacklists, and he's largely kept a ban on US citizens investing in Chinese firms that the US believes are helping the PLA to threaten American security. So I think overall on the positive side of the ledger, he's chalked up some notable and important successes, particularly with allies. But in other areas, Biden's been less successful. He stressed early on, if you remember, that he wanted to approach China from a position of strength and would focus first on rebuilding the US economy and repairing US democracy to show that the Chinese mantra that the East is rising and the West is declining was a total fallacy. And yet, while the US economy has improved dramatically, now gas prices are at a record high, inflation is soaring. The January 6th investigation on Capitol Hill has underscored exactly how strong the threat to American democracy was and potentially still is. And Biden, by most accounts, is likely to lose the House in November and possibly the Senate. So the political horizon for him doesn't look very rosy right now. Then in response to criticism that US policy in the Indo-Pacific was a little bit, too many guns and not enough butter, as some people put it, Biden in Tokyo last month launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I'm happy to talk more about this during the Q&A, but most of the Indo-Pacific officials I've talked to are not hugely enthused by IPEF. They think it's better than nothing, given that the US is not going to join CPTPP, the big trade agreement, anytime soon. But as one official said to me, it's like a fried egg without the yolk. There are many other issues I think I could delve into, but I'd like to return now to Taiwan. In briefings with US officials ahead of Biden-Xi Jinping meetings, they consistently stressed that one of the reasons Biden felt the need to talk to Xi Jinping was to create the guardrails that I talked about a little bit earlier. And as Biden said during one of those meetings with Xi, he said the two leaders have a responsibility to ensure that their rising competition doesn't veer into conflict. And I think there's wide sympathy for that view across the world. But there's no evidence that I can see so far that the two sides have been able to set any guardrails on Taiwan or anything else. And on the contrary, I would say there are many signs pointing in an ominous direction. One of the things that struck me during my meetings in Singapore was that there's an emerging view in the region that the US and China are potentially on a collision course over Taiwan. That might sound a little bit dramatic, but compared to a year ago, I'm hearing more and more people worry about that. And I'm hearing people who a year ago, again, dismissed that notion, saying that they're more willing to entertain the idea now. At the Shangri-La dialogue itself, Lloyd Austin went further than any US Defense Secretary that I can remember doing at the forum in terms of raising concerns about Chinese military activity around Taiwan. He also stressed that the US would maintain its military capacity to resist any force that threatened Taiwan. And while that wasn't a change in US policy, I think the language is not always stressed in public, so that was important. General Wei Fenghe hit back by warning that China would crush any attempt at independence in Taiwan. And to reinforce that, he added, if someone forces a war on China, the PLA will not flinch. And I think one of the things that came across listening to Wei and talking to some other people in the room was that Chinese confidence, or at least rhetorical efforts to kind of portray confidence, have really grown. And one example that was on display in Singapore was related to the hypersonic weapon tests that China conducted in July of 2021. When the FT broke that story last year, China claimed that it wasn't a hypersonic weapon, that it was a test of a space plane. But in Singapore, I actually asked Wei Fenghe why China was not being transparent about its technological military advances. And instead of denying that the test occurred, he appeared to confirm our story for the first time and said it was natural that a rising power like China would be developing new kinds of weapons. So I think that's another example of certainly confidence in the Chinese military. The time when they were kind of hiding their strength or their development and their rise has clearly disappeared. Over the past year, China has become increasingly belligerent towards Taiwan, everything from flying big numbers of warplanes into Taiwan's ADIZ. And in Singapore, US officials revealed that PLA officials in recent months have been arguing to them that the Taiwan Strait is not international waters, a view I think that nobody outside of China entertains. And also the PLA appears to have conveniently forgotten that in 2017, when China was sending its Liaoning aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait with some escort ships, PLA officials stressed that the Taiwan Strait was, quote, an international waterway. So something seems to have changed there. But rhetoric and ADIZ incursions aside, I think much of the concern about the risks to Taiwan between now and 2027 hinge on factors such as the rapid modernization of the Chinese military, the fact that 2027 is the centenary of the PLA, the view that Xi Jinping wants the PLA to have developed the capability to take Taiwan or seize Taiwan by that date. And a year ago, or March 2021, when Admiral Davidson voiced concern about this date, he was met with some dismissive voices. But as I said earlier, in my reporting, I'm coming across more and more people who are worried about something occurring this decade. And I think that's becoming a louder and louder concern. But those concerns are not just limited to the US. I think one of the most interesting developments in the last couple of years, and one that doesn't always get sufficient attention in the media in Washington, is just how much Japan has changed when it comes to considering the threat to Taiwan and what that means to Japan and its security. If you think back to the spring of 2021, when then Japanese Prime Minister Suga visited Washington, became the first leader to meet Joe Biden at the White House, he agreed to include language in the US-Japan joint statement with Biden about the need for peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. Now, those words might seem boilerplate to many people who don't follow the issue in a kind of a very close way, but that was the first time a Japanese leader had agreed to such language since 1969. And back then, China and Japan did not have relations. So I think this was a huge deal. And I remember reading the Japanese newspapers the next morning, and some of the broadsheets, the first 3 pages cover to cover were devoted to Suga's visit and the Taiwan question. But just to illustrate the speed of change in Tokyo, Japanese politicians now routinely talk about the need to ensure peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. It's no longer a taboo subject. In another really big move that didn't get much attention in the media in DC, Japan and Australia earlier this year signed what they call a reciprocal access agreement, which will enable the two militaries to work much more closely together. And that's something that could become critical and very helpful to the US in the case of any war with China. Shortly after Suga visited Washington, South Korean President Moon Jae-in the occupant of the Blue House at the time. He came to Washington. He also included language on Taiwan in his joint statement with Biden. And I would say arguably that was even a much bigger deal than Japan doing it, but it happened on a Friday evening in DC, and frankly, it got almost no attention. At the FT, we've also reported on several developments that underscore the growing concern about Taiwan. Japan has stepped up planning, including various kinds of war games and exercises with the US military to prepare for a Taiwan scenario. And I know that most of you in the virtual audience will know Mike Green and his latest book, which is called Line of Advantage, Japan's Grand Strategy in the Era of Abe Shinzo, former prime minister, does a really good job of explaining why Abe was able to transform Japan in a way that has made some of the security changes much more durable, and also explains why Japan has shifted on China and why that change or evolution is outliving and will continue to outlive Abe himself. But switching democracies, or switching geographies for a second, we also reported a couple of months ago that Kurt Campbell and Laura Rosenberger, the top NSC officials on the Indo-Pacific and China, held sensitive discussions with UK officials in March about what role Britain might play in the event that the US ends up at war with China over Taiwan. And I think the US is increasingly having those kinds of conversations in a nascent way with a lot of allies and partners because of the concern about what could happen in the coming years. Now, one of the most interesting questions in recent months has been how to interpret remarks by President Biden, who has on 3 occasions said that the US would intervene militarily to defend Taiwan. Now, on each occasion, the White House has rolled back his remarks and saying that policy has not changed. And while it may be technically accurate to say that policy has not changed and the US still has a policy of quote unquote strategic ambiguity, I think it's very hard to argue that Biden's words do not have any meaning. Some people have suggested that his comments were just another example of a Biden gaffe. Frankly, I don't buy that at all. My reporting and private conversations with people in DC who are paying very close attention to this suggest that Biden is trying to boost deterrence in a major way because US officials believe the increasing threat from China warrants a different kind of response. I think this also marks a shift from Biden himself. And the reason I say that is just over a year ago, we had a story saying that the Biden administration was worried that Xi Jinping was flirting with seizing control of Taiwan. And I know that after that story ran, Biden actually shouted at one official in the Oval Office about the story because he was worried that the language on Taiwan in Washington was becoming very loose. In terms of timing, it had come several weeks after Admiral Davidson had issued his warning on Capitol Hill. And it was actually on the day at the time that China sent a record number of fighter jets, bombers, and other warplanes into Taiwan's ADIZ. So there was a lot of concern about what was happening. And if you remember a little bit after that last year, that The Economist, I'm happy to tap the competition, had a cover where they said that Taiwan was arguably the most dangerous place in the world. After all of that, Biden told Kurt Campbell that he needed to be very clear in public the next time he was asked that the US policy of strategic ambiguity had not changed and that the US was not thinking about changing to a policy of strategic clarity. So I think that the 3 comments by Biden in recent months about being willing to defend Taiwan suggest strongly that the US is taking a slightly different approach to make China think twice about military action against Taiwan. And I think the other huge factor that's almost certainly playing in here is the role that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has played. You know, there are lots of debates about what Ukraine means for Taiwan. Some of them, I think, very simplistic, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if people would like. But some people argue, and I tend to agree with this, that Biden has decided that Ukraine means he needs to send a strong signal to China about Taiwan. And that was something that came across very strongly when I talked to people in Singapore last week. You know, some experts have argued that Xi Jinping would not risk war with Taiwan now, particularly not before the 20th Party Congress later this year, when he'll be crowned with his 3rd term as chairman of the party. But others point out that the US and other countries consistently underestimate China And some will point to the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong in 2014 and say that back then, few people, and I was living in Hong Kong and actually covered the umbrella revolution, and few people anticipated just how quickly China would crack down on, the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And I think the speed there has been really telling, and it sends a powerful warning to the world and frankly also to Taiwan about one country, two systems. In March, I traveled with Admiral Lakalina, who's the current head of Indo-Pacific Command, as you all know, to Australia. One of the things that he said to me when I interviewed him during the trip was that the Ukraine conflict should underscore to people that threats from authoritarian regimes are not abstract, they're real, blood gets spilled and people die, and it needs to be taken seriously, and people should not be complacent about Taiwan. Whether it's the modernization of the PLA or the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, I think one thing that often gets overlooked is the speed at which China moves. Now, people frequently talk about the scale in China, the scope, such as the size of its Navy, which is now bigger than the US Navy. But I think speed is probably the most impressive attribute of their system. I spent a year roaming around South China for the FT in 2014, and I was constantly stunned at how quickly things changed. And people who came to visit a place just once in China saw the scale. But if you made multiple visits, which I tried to do anytime I went to somewhere new, I would go back again and again, you would see how quickly things changed. And I think that was almost more telling than the scope and the scale. I want to conclude by talking a little bit more about speed, but the lack of speed in Washington. And there are some things that I find very puzzling as I cover the US-China beat. Many people, including supporters of the Biden administration, griped to me, for example, about how long it took the administration, more than 8 months, to produce the China speech that Antony Blinken recently delivered. We're also almost 1.5 years into the administration, and we still don't have a national security strategy or national defense strategy. But the most puzzling thing, and I'm probably being naive here, is why Congress has not done more. If you think about it, no issue unites Democrats and Republicans more than China. There's a general consensus that China poses a growing threat to the US, that the US needs to be more competitive, and yet very little has happened on Capitol Hill. I've not counted the actual number of China bills that have been introduced, but there must be 200 to 300 pieces of legislation that have been introduced this congressional session. And as far as I can tell, there's only been one big bill passed, and that was the Xinjiang forced labor legislation. Now, obviously the House and Senate are currently in conference to hammer out a compromise from the two big China bills that have been passed in the House and the Chamber and the Senate separately. They may get there, but not everyone is optimistic. And I think, at one point, I argued that the midterm elections would make life tough for Biden, since he will most likely lose the Democratic majority in the House. But given that the Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate and White House controlled by the Democrats, and the fact that most Republicans also want to be tough on China, given all of that, we haven't seen any results. So I'm actually not sure how big an impact a switch to a Republican majority in the House will actually have in terms of kind of concrete moves on foreign policy. So let me wrap up by saying I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm very pessimistic about US-China relations. When you think about the political landscape in the US, including the fact that China is going to loom even larger in the 2024 presidential election, I think, than it did in 2016 when Trump won. When you look at the political landscape in China, where Xi Jinping will largely be thinking about legacy once he starts his third term, I think it's very hard to see any reason for optimism. So I'd like to thank you for listening. One of the advantages of a virtual event like this is, unlike the situation in my house where my kids roll their eyes when I say anything that they say is lame, I have no idea if you've been rolling your eyes and saying lame during my talk, but I'd like to thank you. Look forward to your questions and comments showing why my pessimism is misplaced. So Akimoto-san, back to you, and thank you very much.
Well, Demetri, thank you very much for your insightful remarks, supported by your analysis, comment by experts, and anecdote. I really appreciated you taking time and doing it. If I may, you mentioned both the United States and Japan with regard to Taiwan situation and also Shangri-La dialogue. Just a little disclaimer, but I'm a fellow at the IISS and I take Shangri-La seriously. But you know, what's the Defense Minister Kishi was there as well, and Prime Minister, of course, Kishida was there. What's the coordination between Japan and United States in terms of how to deal with possible aggression of China vis-a-vis Taiwan, in your view?
I think, you know, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned, Abe, our former Prime Minister Abe, set Japan on a different course, I think, vis-a-vis China. And, you know, he's still playing that role in the background with some of his public comments since he left office, and particularly this year. So the rhetoric has changed. I think it's been stunning, not just at how Japanese politicians are more willing to talk openly about Taiwan in this regard, compared to a few years ago, when again, it was, you know, maybe taboo is too strong a word, but it certainly wasn't common. And if someone made a comment about Taiwan, it really stood out. Now it's become mainstream and it happens all the time. And it's not just the politicians. I think possibly an even more important shift is that the Japanese bureaucracy, certainly a large part of the foreign ministry, definitely the defense ministry, and other parts of the government are increasingly hawkish about China. Down through the bureaucracy. And I think it kind of a simple example of this, and I hope I'm not wrong, I hope he's still there, but the ambassador to Beijing from Japan, Ambassador Tarumi, you know, comes from the Taiwan school inside the Japanese foreign ministry. And I met Tarumi-san a number of years ago in Beijing. And when he got appointed as ambassador, I thought that's a big shift. With Japan sending someone from the Taiwan school to Beijing signals that the foreign ministry has become or the more hawkish school inside the foreign ministry has the upper hand when it comes to their approach on China. You know, in the military realm, and possibly, you know, some of your guests, listeners might have something to say on this. You know, there have been stepped up efforts to do various kinds of war games, tabletop exercises. I think more training and joint exercises with US military around the Senkaku. And while that is important to help train for any Senkaku scenario, the truth is that a lot of the training you do around the Senkaku is also applicable to a Taiwan scenario. So you can train for a Senkaku scenario, frankly, pretend that it's got nothing to do with Taiwan, but actually you're doing training for Taiwan as well. So I think there's a lot more of that happening. Much of it is not public. You know, we've written a little bit about it where we've been able to. But I think behind the scenes, you know, if people were able to say frankly what was going on, you'd find that there's an awful lot happening between the US and Japan. And as I mentioned, the agreement, the RAA agreement between Japan and Australia, which surprisingly didn't get huge attention here, again, was one of these big deals that signals that Japan is willing to take a much more assertive stance on this issue.
Thank you. You mentioned Ambassador Tarumi, and obviously he is one of the deepest thinkers about the China in Japan or policy circles. And I thought it was appointment was also interesting because his previous assignment in Beijing ended prematurely. So I thought, no, there's a signal there. I would like to open up the floor for Q&A. And our first question goes to Professor Joe Nye of Harvard. He is a member of the advisory board of Sasakawa USA as well. Joe?
Thank you very much. I thought that was a terrific performance. Rather than lame, I would say it was Olympian. Well run. But let me push you a bit on the Taiwan question. There's been a bipartisan concern in Washington for some time about Chinese military capacity increasing and thereby giving an incentive for China to think that they have to act while they have a window open. Alternatively, there are two things you can do. One is to increase our military posture in the area. The other is to get more living space for Taiwan. And if you think of it from the point of view of Beijing, the first of those is more likely to reduce the risk of conflict. The second is more likely to increase the role of conflict. And essentially, the administration has been doing a lot to increase the officiality of the contacts with Taiwan, and perhaps not seeing how this plays in Beijing. What do you see as this sort of balance of deterrence versus provocation as perceived not in Washington, but in Beijing?
I think that's, Professor Knight, it's a really interesting question. It's something that came up in discussion in Singapore in kind of private conversations, particularly with officials from Southeast Asia. And I did hear, I won't mention the countries, but I did hear from some officials that they welcomed the US in some ways taking a tough stance. They appreciated what Biden was doing with allies in the region. They did have some concern that some of the language on Taiwan, and as you said, kind of making the US-Taiwan relationship a little bit more formal, whether that's easing the restrictions on US officials meeting their Taiwanese counterparts, et cetera, that was potentially going to provoke China into doing something, or at least would bring China more in that direction and make them more uncomfortable. I think the difficulty is with this question is that it's a chicken and egg question. Which came first? Is the US doing things that is provoking China and should take responsibility, or is China becoming increasingly assertive towards Taiwan, potentially threatening action that would undermine, the US-led international rules-based order since the end of the Second World War, and therefore the US actually has to step up support for Taiwan, within the boundaries of the one China policy and everything else, but try and do it in a way that doesn't cross whatever China's red line is. I think it's a really difficult question. To me, the backdrop to all of this, and something I didn't mention in my remarks, is, regardless of whether you're incredibly hawkish on China and Washington, or you're less hawkish, or one of the 5 remaining doves on China that exist in the city, it strikes me that it's very hard to have a real conversation about China and Washington these days. Sometimes if I quote someone who's less hawkish, I'll have more hawkish people text me and say, why are you quoting such and such a person? To which I respond that I'm not Xi Jinping and I don't censor people. But I think it kind of illustrates why the Biden administration is sort of hemmed in a way. They feel like they have to do more on Taiwan. And I think some of the people in the administration pushing for these changes that you express concern about genuinely feel it's the right thing to do. And I think there's also people pushing for those changes because they feel it insulates them from criticism on Capitol Hill that they're not tough enough on China. So very difficult question. But as I said, with Southeast Asian officials, I definitely did hear, is the US going a little bit too far? And are we on a path to collision path between the US and China?
Thank you.
Thank you. Joe, do you have any response, or are you okay?
Well, I was just curious whether any of that has changed as a result of the Ukraine war, because there is a view that the Ukraine war could give Beijing the view that the Americans are preoccupied elsewhere and now is a good time to act. Alternatively, you can say, look, if my friend Vlad had so much trouble with a land invasion based in the friendly country right next door, Belarus, maybe I ought to be a little bit more careful. So I don't know whether that balance you described is, what's the net effect of Ukraine on that balance in Beijing?
It's very difficult. I'm not trying to be coy here, but I think it's very difficult to know, because the actual amount of genuine exchange right now between scholars in China or Chinese officials and people outside of China has been severely limited. So it's difficult to tell. You could argue it both ways. If you look at how the Russian military has performed very badly for lots of different reasons, you could argue that China needs to sit back and say, well, hold on a second, we've never fought a major global conflict. We don't know if the PLA is up to it. People thought Russia would do much better. The Pentagon thought the Russian forces would overwhelm Kyiv in a few days, and the Ukrainian military wouldn't last more than 2 weeks. Well, that didn't happen. So is China looking at that and thinking, does it need to reassess what its real capabilities are? Or does it look at the fact that the US is now once again preoccupied with another part of the world? The pivot is potentially being undone on another occasion, and decide that it's actually a good time to act. But I think regardless, no one expects anything to happen this year. Xi Jinping has got his own domestic issues to worry about. But certainly the PLA is going to be studying very, very closely what's happening in Ukraine, and I'm sure they'll draw lessons from that. But I think that, just to kind of reiterate what I said a few minutes ago, I think the fact that Biden has shifted from telling his officials, be really clear that the policy is strategic ambiguity, to saying publicly 3 times, I will defend Taiwan militarily, with the most obvious example being in Tokyo, in the region, during the Ukraine war. I think that that's really important. And again, I don't think it's a gaffe. I think it underscores the US concern that China might actually take the wrong lessons from Ukraine, and therefore the US has to send a big message of deterrence, or an even bigger message of deterrence now.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would like to pose a question by Admiral Timothy Keating, the first Pacific commander, I guess Demetri worked very closely with. Is China's 3rd aircraft carrier, granted several years away from a deployment, likely to be a major factor in regional stability?
That's a very good question. That's the kind of question that I would have posed to Admiral Keating, and I'm sure he actually knows the answer much better than I do. So maybe he or Admiral Davidson would like to weigh in. But what impact will it have? I mean, I think it clearly shows, again, that how quickly China is developing. I mean, I think back to, I moved to Hong Kong in 2009. And, people were only talking about Chinese aircraft carriers. The Chinese Navy was still smaller than the US Navy. The Chinese Coast Guard was smaller than the US Coast Guard. And, 10, 11, 12, 13 years on, look where we are now. So I think, it's a big development. It shows their ambitions. How it contributes to, peace and stability in the Southeast, the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the broader Pacific remains to be seen. It really depends on how China uses its military. And what we've seen so far is that China, whether it's its Coast Guard, its Navy, its maritime militias, has not been as responsible a military as the US and others would like it to be. And one of the interesting things that came up in Singapore, which I didn't mention, was over the last couple of years, the number of incidents between the US military and the Chinese military, whether Navy ships at sea or incidents in the air, have really declined. For whatever reason, China has decided not to undertake some of the provocative things it did before. But it started doing it with Canada and with Australia. And several months ago, a Chinese fighter jet came, I think, roughly 300 meters in front of a P-8 surveillance aircraft and released chaff, which entered the engine of the Australian aircraft. And it was hugely dangerous. So I think you're seeing China being a little bit more cautious with the US for various reasons, but at the same time, as the US increases its joint exercises and military activity with allies in the region, China is, I think, now focusing on some of those and trying to bully those countries as kind of the weaker link in the chain as they see it. Sorry, that probably didn't answer the question, but it's the best I could do.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pose a question by Mr. Patrick Cronin. Xi Jinping has warned against stronger alliances. Is that a talking point, or are there red lines Xi Jinping might have in mind over AUKUS, Japanese defense spending, NATO countries in Asia, etc.?
I mean, it's hard to do. How do you define a Chinese red line? I think, like with all red lines, unless they actually announce something, you'll only see it when you cross it and you see the response. I don't personally think that AUKUS or other arrangements like that, are a red line. I think the red line is and always will be Taiwan, and anything that the US and its allies and partners do that China thinks dramatically undermines its ability to reunite with Taiwan in the future is probably the red line. But it's hard to see the US and the allies doing something of a provocative nature like that would amount to a red line, unless China did something like seize some of the outer islands around Taiwan, and kind of the salami slicing approach that it took in the South China Sea. I think a big question is, will it do something like that around Taiwan? Do small things that are big things, but small things that don't rise to the level that the White House feels that it needs to respond or can respond without risking a war, and then over time, gradually moves into doing something bigger in Taiwan. But again, I think that's where the red line will be. I don't think that alliances or security groupings, Quad, etc., is a red line in itself.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Mr. Jim Schoaf, Senior Director of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Jim?
Thank you so much, Demetri, for your comments. Very interesting, and they really are in sync with everything that I've been seeing, what you described, this trend of putting a sharper edge to US policy vis-a-vis deterrence on Taiwan, and then also how to deal with strategic ambiguity. So I wanted to ask, you've touched on this a little bit already, but based on your trip to Singapore and other discussions, part of this sharper edge to deterrence is also kind of multilateralizing in the region, as you alluded to on the comments, G7 comments or comments with Prime Minister Suga about Taiwan, trying to build some consensus and a coalition to push back against Chinese pressure on Taiwan. And I wonder to what extent you feel there maybe is a consensus emerging in the region, especially in light of what's gone on in Ukraine, that yes, this is something we need to do more to send a signal to China and also be prepared for a potential contingency, because who is going to play that role that NATO is playing in support of Ukraine in a Taiwan contingency? And then if I can ask just a little addendum to that is the nuclear question, which has also kind of come out of the Ukraine situation and the potential looser talk about potential use of nuclear weapons in conflict, and whether, I know the White House has talked a lot and complained a lot about China's push now to improve, modernize, and increase its nuclear weapons capability, and whether or not you sense that this is kind of a newer emerging problem in the U.S.-China relationship going forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. In terms of what's happening in the region, I think the answer is yes. I think it was happening before Ukraine, and it's only been accelerated now. I mean, I mentioned the things that the US and Japan are doing that 5 years ago, there was much less of that. The conversations happening in Japan, the AUKUS agreement, other things that the US is doing with Australia. So for example, when I traveled with Admiral Aquilino to Australia, I think we were there for 6 days, which is a very long time for a commander to spend in a country. And the conversation was all about how do you do more with allies to counter China, everything from maritime initiatives to doing things in space to counter what China is doing, and to have better visibility on Chinese weapons development and, hypersonic weapons, for example, when they're fired, are you able to see them through the course of their flight? So there's a lot happening. South Korea with the new conservative Yoon administration has made positive signals that it wants to do more on China. Probably not in the same way as Japan and Australia, but that's a shift from the previous Moon administration, which I think frustrated the US a little bit on occasions. So I think with the kind of core allies, you're seeing more. While India is never going to have a full security relationship with the US as the allies do, it's moving slowly in that direction, which is a big change, and obviously reflects the conflict and skirmishes on the China-India border that have been had numbers of fatalities. So I think largely, there's this shift. I think where it's a bit more complicated is Southeast Asia. Obviously Singapore is a major logistics hub for the US Navy. It's something it doesn't advertise every day, but it's, if there was a conflict over Taiwan, that logistics hub, I think, is quite important. Other countries in Southeast Asia feel caught in the middle. And then you have countries like Cambodia, which by all accounts is allowing China to build a serious military base in the country. And, I think the US is going to struggle to make any difference with countries like that. But overall, I think there's a big shift, and Ukraine has accelerated that. On the nuclear question, it's funny. I mean, we started writing about this last year when the Pentagon came out and said that it projected that China would essentially quadruple its nuclear warhead arsenal by the end of this decade to roughly 1,000 warheads. And some people think it'll be more than that. I mean, that has changed the conversation. China is now, a major nuclear power and on its way to being a much bigger one. And the question is, how does that factor into US considerations about nuclear policy and how it deals with its adversaries? And, for the first time, in a serious way, for the first time, the US no longer has to think about one major nuclear adversary being Russia. It has to think about two. And I think, I've been taking part in kind of private events where people have been thinking about this out loud. And it's very clear to me that we're really at the start of the process of thinking about what the implications are. There's various congressional commissions and other groups who are looking at this, but I think it's a key question. And one of the questions I asked General Wei was, with your hypersonic weapon, which is nuclear capable, is that something that's for a Taiwan scenario, or is that something that has broader applicability? Because China says so little about what it's doing with its nuclear forces, we don't know. And a final point I would make is, after Biden and Xi spoke, I forget if it was the September call or the November virtual meeting. But anyway, the following day, Jake Sullivan said that they had talked about the possibility of having strategic security talks about nuclear arsenals. My understanding is there has been absolutely no movement on that whatsoever, that China has got no interest in having those conversations, despite what Xi Jinping and Biden talked about in their call. So early days, but clearly a massively important issue.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask a question posed by Ms. Emma Shanlett Avery of CRS. Any areas at all for potential cooperation? Are the DPRK climate arenas completely hopeless because of the overall atmosphere?
That's a good question, and morning, Emma. Emma's daughter and my son are in the same class at school, so we see each other from time to time. My sense is that there is very little cooperation. On North Korea, it doesn't sound like China is willing to play ball at the moment. On climate, I think John Kerry has been working very hard to try and do things for the Chinese, but we don't hear very much about it at the moment. It feels like everything has gone very quiet. So I can't really think of, I might be missing something, but I can't think of any area right now where, when I talk to US officials, they say that they have a kind of a positive or constructive engagement with Chinese officials on issue X. I might be missing something, but I just don't see it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go to Ambassador Kurt Ton to ask a question. Ambassador Ton is a member of Sasakawa USA Advisory Board.
Hi, everybody. And thanks, Demetri, for excellent and interesting comments. I wanted to just make a brief comment and then a question. The comment is that I think you're absolutely right that the president's remarks on Taiwan of late are not gaffes, but I would venture that they are a tweaked version of strategic ambiguity. Strategic ambiguity with a twist, that there's still ambiguity about what the U.S. would do, but the U.S. would do something, and that the objective that the president is pursuing still is that of stability through deterrence. I found your comment that some policymakers might be making decisions about diplomatic positioning vis-a-vis Taiwan, et cetera, out of fear of Congress, to be deeply disturbing. As a voting and tax-paying U.S. citizen, I do not want to be brought into a more dangerous situation because of people's fear of other Americans for political reasons. And just want to call out the concern about political posturing in campaign seasons vis-a-vis Taiwan. I think Taiwan should be banned from the election agenda unless people can discuss it responsibly. My question is broader. Before the Biden administration took office, a lot of the folks that are currently working there were using the term competitive coexistence to describe the ideal form of the relationship with China, or the expected form given US interests. And now we just hear competition, and occasionally responsible competition, in the sense of we're going to have competition, but we're not going to let it become self-destructive or mutually assured destructive. But where did that go? And is it still there? Do you hear anyone discussing the notion that coexistence is a objective that's shared simultaneously with competition? I'm not advocating here. It's just a straight up question.
Thanks, Kurt. And first, I would just say that I agree with you, your comment on kind of tweaked strategic ambiguity. I do think that's what's happening as well. On coexistence, you hear it from time to time. You know, when Blinken gave his China speech, you know, he stressed that, you know, that the US doesn't want a Cold War with China and wants to be able to do certain things together. But in practice, when you look at the policies that are being implemented and the way people describe those policies, whether it's in background briefings or private conversations, there's not a lot of talk about coexistence. I think there is, I think, resignation, a little bit of resignation and more pessimism than there was when the Biden team came in. My sense is there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, you know, a lot of the officials who came in, who had been in the Obama administration, came in with a certain view. And the way it's been described to me is once they saw the intelligence, or they read up on the intelligence on China over the first few months of the administration and kind of caught up with what China had been doing, and then saw the fresh intelligence about what China has been doing over the last 16, 17 months, that they became, you know, from wherever they started, they became a little bit more hawkish. So I think that's one thing. I think, you know, and I kind of alluded to this in the talks, a year ago, some officials said to me they hoped to make Xi Jinping change course in a few small ways if they could. I don't hear anyone saying that anymore. And again, all you hear about now is shaping the international environment, which to me, another way of saying that is we've given up on trying to change Chinese behavior. And so what we have to do is strengthen the environment around China, make other countries stronger, reinforce, you know, the free and open Indo-Pacific and everything that goes with that. So I think the mood has changed. I think also the diplomatic interactions between the US and China, certainly below the level of the two presidents, hasn't really produced anything. You know, US officials will say that maybe there are warnings to China not to supply Russia with weapons for Ukraine had an impact, and that China was really thinking about doing it, but backed off. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I do hear that from time to time. But aside from that, you hear very few examples of, again, constructive engagement. So it feels like there's almost like a diplomatic decoupling of sorts that's gone on. And it's very hard to see at the moment any sign for optimism for how you get back to a place where the two sides are having constructive conversations about anything, you know, beyond Taiwan, obviously.
Kurt, any comment?
Well, just, I guess as a sort of a follow-up question or half comment, is that giving up on changing China through negotiation or otherwise wouldn't necessarily preclude coexistence on some aspects of China's existence, which are not objectionable to the United States. And the question is whether there is identification of elements of China which the US can live without either changing them or confronting or combating, competing, et cetera.
Well, I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, sometimes when I listen to, you know, I'm an Irish citizen, I've been in America a long time, but I still like to think of myself as an outsider. I think sometimes in Washington, there's a tendency for people to kind of talk about China and relations with China and China's place in the world as if the US can kind of control everything and that China has no agency. The reality is the two countries have to coexist because the two countries are on the planet, they're not disappearing. China's getting stronger, and it's clear, and Chinese officials say this, they said it at Shangri-La, they basically say, and I'm not subscribing to this view, but they say the US has been a bully, we're no longer going to be bullied anymore, we're much more powerful, you can't push us around, we're investing money in Southeast Asia, we want to join CPTPP, we've joined other trade agreements, the US isn't able to do that. You know, and stop being a hegemon. I mean, Xi Jinping said that essentially at the BRICS summit yesterday. But at the end of the day, the two countries have to coexist. There isn't any other way around it. The question is how they coexist and are there places where they can work together? And I think that's where at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any room for maneuver. And, you know, the one thing I would say, which is slightly tangential, but, you know, I tend to think of U.S. China relationship in the world as a big school playground. And I've said this to maybe some people on the call before. The U.S. has been the huge kid in the corner of the playground for a long time. It's had lots of different kinds of friends that want to hang out with it for different reasons. And now on this other side of the playground, you have this other huge kid that doesn't have as many friends, but it's spending a lot of money to kind of bring kids into its side of the playground. And I think one of the biggest struggles for Washington, and I think this reflects why some people text me and say, don't quote people who are less hawkish, is that, you know, Americans are very confident people. Every time I've lived here, I think about how people, they always say this, that in America is the biggest and best in the world. And in many cases it is. But psychologically, I don't think the vast majority of people in Washington have got their head around the fact that China is huge, here to stay, and again, is going to be coexisting with the US, whether Washington likes it or not. And I think there's a psychological adjustment that needs to happen in this city before you actually have a much, frankly, smarter and more nuanced discussion about how the US handles China. Because right now, I think, you know, there's an awful lot of, I won't use any Irish terms, an awful lot of fluff that gets thrown around in Washington, dressed up as analysis, which is just not that.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I'd like to go to a question posed by Ms. Wendy Cutler. China has been quite vocal in criticizing IPEF. Do you think Beijing feels potentially threatened by this initiative or its potential outcomes, particularly on supply chains, or this is just a talking point among many criticizing recent regional groupings that do not include Beijing, or both?
That's a good question. Thanks, Wendy. I think there's an element of concern about supply chains, but frankly, I think that predated IPEF. Maybe it's been exacerbated by IPEF, because, you know, China itself is worried about supply chains. You know, I spent a year visiting factories in South China and just seeing how the supply chains worked. And even back then, you know, global companies were increasingly slowly, but shifting out of China for different reasons, because labor costs in China were rising and Vietnam was seen as an attractive destination. I think, you know, the focus by the Biden administration on making US supply chains more secure post the pandemic, ensuring that, you know, the US military can get everything that it needs, et cetera, is definitely another concern for China. But I think the criticism about IPEF is more about criticizing, you know, what Wei Fenghe also said in Singapore, which is the US creating these kind of blocks. Frankly, and some people won't like me for saying this, most people I talk to on IPEF say that there's nothing there. I haven't, publicly officials will be very nice about it because they want the US to be economically engaged in the region, and doing something is better than doing nothing. But when I talk to people in Singapore, everyone is incredibly dismissive. They basically said, this is really the US imposing, for the most part, its domestic priorities, supply chains being a big one, on these other countries. And while a lot of countries signed up at the end of the day, because frankly, the language in the agreement was watered down, and Japan and Singapore really urged ASEAN countries to sign up to make it look good and to have some kind of engagement with Biden. Most of them said, there's nothing in it for us. What does it actually bring us? And what everybody wants in the region is for the US to join CPTPP. And frankly, that's not going to happen. So IPEF is maybe the best that the US can do right now, but I haven't met anyone who privately has said to me, we think this is a great idea.
Thank you very much. Two last questions in 5 minutes. A question by Tomohiko Taniguchi from Tokyo. In response to the question, you said the US administration had raised with the UK as to London's possible responses to military confrontation over Taiwan. What did the UK official say?
If I knew the answer to that, I would have written a follow-on story. It's very sensitive. UK was unhappy that this story got out into the media. So I don't know what the content of the conversations were. But if anyone on this call does know, you can find me easily and we can talk afterwards.
Great. Thank you very much. The last question is from Admiral Robert Natter. Given Vietnam's past 4 decades of conflict with both the United States and China, do you envision any risk and opportunity for the involvement of Vietnam in the China conflict in the Southeast and South and the East China Sea in the South and East China regions? Should the US and our allies be more aggressive in our effort to develop our strategic and military-to-military relationship with Vietnam?
So I'm not an expert on Vietnam, so I'm not going to try and wing it. I'll just say that, it's clear that the US has been making a big push to do more with Vietnam, whether it's allowing US Navy ships to visit various places. That relationship is in a much better place than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. But the idea that countries in Southeast Asia could become like genuine defense allies, with the exception of Thailand and the Philippines, which already are, but at Vietnam and certainly not at Cambodia, I think is hard to see. I mean, I think the one thing, for example, that came out in Singapore, and this is a slight detour, but it explains the issue. There's a lot of US criticism towards Cambodia right now for allowing China to build what we think is going to be a big military base. But people in the region said to me, what would you do if you're Cambodia? The US is not offering a huge amount in response, and Cambodia has this huge neighbor on its doorstep that can put pressure on it, that it has a huge trade relationship with, and that is also supplying it with money for various things and helping it develop the base, even if it's for its own use. So I think it's, Vietnam is in a slightly different situation, but Vietnam is, a big Chinese neighbor. And I think it's important to remember sometimes that it's very easy from Washington to say country X, Y, or Z should do such and such. But when your neighbor is China, it's not always that easy to do that. So Vietnam, I think there will be more cooperation, but whether you have a real strategic agreement and whether Vietnam would get drawn into military operations in any kind of US conflict with China, I don't know enough about Vietnam to be able to answer that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sevastopulo. Thank you very much for spending time and sharing your insight and knowledge with us to deepen our understanding of the situation with regard to evolving U.S.-China relationship under President Biden's administration. So thank you very much. And you touched upon this, but there have been lots of changes going on in Japan as well. Prime Minister Kishida, Japan is going to have an upper house election on July 10th, and they are expected to have this full review of national security strategy, being announced toward the end of the year. So reflecting your deep knowledge of Japan and experiences in Japan, I plan to invite you to talk about evolution of Japan-China relationship under Kishida administration. So looking forward to it sometime down the road. So thank you very much for spending time. And you have a last word, if you have any?
No, I'd just like to thank you for inviting me, and thank you to everyone for listening. And now that the world has kind of opened up in Washington, if anyone ever wants to go for a summer evening drink, again, you know where to find me.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. Looking forward to seeing you soon.